All right, welcome back to the Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we have Peter Sonski, who is the presidential candidate for the American Solidarity Party for election 24. Peter, thanks so much for coming on.
Stephen, thank you. Thanks for your interest in the American Solidarity Party. I'm grateful for the
Absolutely.
opportunity.
Yeah, so for people who've been following the podcast, the Substack for a while, we've done a lot of work with people involved in ASP. We've had Albert Thompson on, we had Amar Patel do a guest piece. So we're very much excited to have Peter talking about the presidential campaign. But first off, for people who aren't familiar with the American Solidarity Party, can you give people a sense of, first of all, how did it grow? How did it come to be? But also, what are some of the main tenets of the party?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Um, the American Solidarity Party was formed in a formal sense in 2016. Its genesis was a little bit before that here in the United States, but it comes from an even longer history of a movement in politics known as Christian democracy. That has deeper roots, Stephen, in both Europe and more recently in Latin America. But the American Solidarity Party is its only manifestation, if you will, in the United States. So as I say, the party was formalized in 2016. It had a presidential candidate in that year, and it also had a presidential candidate in the 2020 election. And now I am its nominee for 2024. What it stands for. Well, Christian democracy had its origins in the late 19th century, and it was an effort to try to bridge a gap between um, a, um, a growing sentiment toward socialism and communism on one side of the spectrum and an overly zealous capitalism on the opposite side of the spectrum, because this was a period of industrial revolution in the United States, but also in Europe. And it was a time in which a lot of people were moving from a subsistence type of living to full employment, often in manufacturing. And there was a great concern for the rights and the proper respect for labor, for workers.
Mhm.
That is the broad sense of where it comes from. It has developed through time and adopted a lot of tenets of Christian social teaching. And I stress that even though these have Christianity and even in some cases Catholicism very fundamentally at the root, this is by no means an effort to be integralist. It's no means an effort to be a theocracy. It's simply to say that these tenets that we stand for, life, for example, from conception until natural death, concern for the environment, concern for labor, as I've already cited. All of these things have a foundation in natural law and concern for human beings, human dignity. And they all are very complementary of one another. So while they are coming from a Christian perspective, they are understood as being applicable in a pluralist society such as we have in the United States.
So now that people have a better sense of what ASP is about, how it came to be, tell us a little bit more about yourself, your own background, and how you ended up in this position running for the ASP's the presidential campaign.
Sure, thank you, Stephen. So I was born when John Kennedy was president, and throughout my early lifetime, my parents were both from blue-collar backgrounds. Um, my father's family immigrated to the United States in the 1920s. My mother's family immigrated to the United States just before the turn of the 20th century. And both families were employed in the textile industry, which was very common here in Connecticut, where I live. So I grew up in a blue-collar environment and was registered as a Democrat from my first opportunity to vote, and voted in my first election for Jimmy Carter for president. Jimmy Carter was defeated by Ronald Reagan, for those who recall history, and um, that is in his Jimmy Carter's effort at re-election. He was elected, obviously, in 1976, and then in 1980, when I voted for him, Ronald Reagan was elected. And I slowly began to see some of the views of Reagan and became what was commonly known in that time as a Reagan Democrat, and then later became a Reagan Republican through the second term that Reagan had in office, and also George H.W. Bush's presidency. So when after President George Bush, Bush 41, was defeated in his reelection bid, Clinton was elected, and I began to lose favor with Republican Party politics. I didn't see them as sympathetic to some of the social issues that were important to me. And I left the Republican Party in the mid-1990s and was in search of something from that time forward. In 2016, I voted third party because I was unhappy with the offering that the Americans were given between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and was worried that that was going to be a likely outcome in 2020, which was proven true. And fortunately, in 2018, I found the American Solidarity Party. And it fit me like a glove, Stephen. All of the tenets, all of the principles of the ASP fit my worldview perfectly. So I embraced it and have been very active as a member of the ASP since then. I have a background in local government. I was involved in local government several years ago, initially, both at what's known here in Connecticut as a finance board member, as also a selectman, or what might be equivalent in many people's mind to a city councilman. And then most recently, I've been, and still am, until my term expires here in a very short time, a member of a regional board of education.
So, I mean, now having a better sense of your own background, but also, the kind of legacy that the ASP has been building up, what would you say is particular about the 2020 Forum platform? What changes may have been made? What things may be emphasized this year that you think is worth pointing out to people who are new to the party?
Well, I don't think there's been substantive changes in the ASP platform, but I do think that clearly the emphasis on human rights and human dignity is going to be very important. The Democratic Party, for example, is not an advocate of protecting life in the womb. And that was the reason that I left the Democratic Party in the first place. I felt that it was inconsistent to say that it stood for human rights and human welfare in so many other ways, but couldn't defend the most innocent of human life, life in utero. And then also the leading candidate, at least as the polls would indicate, for the Republicans, Donald Trump, has come out recently and indicated that he doesn't feel that the issues of life are as valuable and that they should be left to the states to decide. He's an advocate of having some sort of shall we say, threshold on abortions. And so those are certainly issues of concern. How about the environment? Stephen, we've seen a terrible year in terms of, shall we say, natural disasters. We've had terrible storms, we've had terrible fires, we've had other incidences that we can no longer deny are not being contributed to on the part of human beings. We've got to become better stewards of our environment and be able to manage our climate, both for our own future and the future of the human race. So those are issues that I think are really outstanding. Universal health care is a concern of the ASP. We want everyone to have access to affordable and comprehensive healthcare in the United States, the wealthiest nation. We should be able to do this much more efficiently than our present system offers. Those are three major areas that come to mind. But international peace and solidarity is a big one. Right now, there's an awful lot of conflict in the world. We've got a war continuing between Russia and Ukraine, and more recently, turmoil in the Middle East. So these are all concerns of the ASP. And I think, especially given the political climate we have here in the United States, the unhappiness that so many people have with the partisan bickering and the dysfunction that has been so evident in U.S. government, it's an opportunity for a third party to come to the fore and hopefully for people to recognize the value that third parties can bring into our government systems.
And I'm also wondering, could you say a little bit more about your own personal, like intellectual and political influences? Like who's kind of shaped your view of the issues?
Um, well, in college I studied philosophy
Mhm.
and the philosophy of personalism, and I think probably Karol Wojtyła, or better known as Pope John Paul II, was a huge influence in my own understanding of human dignity. That's why I said earlier that when I found the ASP, it fit me so perfectly. It
Mhm.
shaped my worldview was very much in line with this. So I would offer that he is perhaps the single biggest influence um, in terms of philosophy. In terms of my own experience, I'm the father of a large family. I have 9 adult children. I see that they are experiencing an entirely different economy than my wife and I did when we were their ages. They struggle much more with making ends meet, with managing housing and the costs that are associated just with day-to-day living. And I know that this is not unique to my family, but it's a problem that's growing throughout the United States. Um, the debt crisis that we have in the United States continues to be an unrelenting burden for us, and we need to be more efficient in the way we manage things. The economic view of the ASP is one that's really centered on subsidiarity, and that's a big term that may be unfamiliar with your viewers and listeners, but it really means that decisions should be made at the lowest efficient level when it comes to people's lives and welfare. It should be made at the local level if it can be, if in terms of government, meaning either the municipal or the county level, because that's where people's lives are most affected. And I think that that means that we can reduce the government bureaucracy that we have stacked at state and national or federal levels and try to place a greater emphasis on the local level. We also are very supportive of local economies and wanting to see local businesses thrive, for individuals to have entrepreneurial opportunities so that they can grow and prosper themselves rather than constantly being just a cog in the wheel of a large and sometimes very unfriendly toward labor commercial enterprise.
Yeah, so I mean, this point about subsidiarity, it's interesting because again, it's this emphasis on problems being addressed on the most local level possible, not going straight to the federal government to resolve issues, because obviously the federal government is at a far remove from the everyday lives of most normal people. Whereas the people who I live with, my neighbors, my family, my local government, is more likely to understand what's at stake in whatever issue. But so that being said, like if if you get this position, at a federal level, if the ASP enters into power on a higher political level, how would it help to foster the agency of local communities? How would it help to really create a culture of subsidiarity rather than replacing the role of the local community or everyday people?
Right. I think that's a great way to phrase it, because it's something that has to be fostered. We have a culture. We have a culture that's grown accustomed to the involvement of these higher levels of government wanting to have influence and direction over our lives. So we need to begin to focus that downwards. And the way that I perceive is doing that most effectively is to begin to diminish the roles of federal bureaucracies.
Mhm.
So does it mean, for example, getting rid of the U.S. Department of Education as a starting example, and bringing more control to local communities in the decisions that they implement in education? I shared earlier, Stephen, that I'm a local school board member. I've served in that capacity for 2 terms, which is 8 years. And we receive an awful lot of policy mandates that come to us from higher levels. Um, those things that we consider valuable or consider unique about our own local circumstances often don't come into play. We're often told that we must do this because this is state legislation or federal legislation. And quite often that means that there is no funding involved with implementing the changes. So not only are we unable to um, direct the education of our children exclusively as we would prefer, but we also are forced quite often to pay for implementation of changes that are handed to us as edicts. So I guess that's a starting example of what I mean, but it needs to be a change in culture, a change in the way we view how we manage our lives. And you know what, Stephen, it's going to take an awful lot of responsibility on the part of people at local levels to adopt this and to want to grasp this authority, which they rightfully should have. Um, it's sometimes a default for us to just accept, well, I can't do anything by the state or the federal levels. But we need to claim that we have those rights and we should have that authority to manage our affairs on a level that's closest to the people as possible.
Yeah, and I was going to say this is part of the issue that, the federal government can afford local communities, local governments more agency, more opportunities to take action. But the issue with subsidiarity is that it's saying that, the everyday person has to take up their responsibility. They have to take a risk. They have to get involved. And that's more of a moral, even spiritual issue than a political one. Because if people don't feel compelled to take charge of their communities, to be invested in, whatever local needs there may be, then this is what creates these the incentive to have these giant bureaucratic structures. So it's part of it's the role of the government, part of it is us everyday people. We have a choice too. So I wonder, like, what would you say to that moral and spiritual question? Like, how can we foster such a culture where people feel like, it's worthwhile to take responsibility, to get involved in local government or local community boards, etc.?
You know, yours is an interesting point, and I see some validity in it. But I'd also say that um, this is the way we began as a nation. We had exclusively local rule when we were in our infancy. And what's happened over time is that these larger echelons, these larger levels of government, have sought um, to gain more power
Mhm.
and more control over funding and influence. And so I think what's happened is that this power has gone upwards as we've grown as a nation and as senior levels of government have had their way. Um, if there is that impetus at that level, Stephen, for wanting to have control, wanting to have what is perceived as rightful authority, then I would offer that that should also be present at the lower levels. I think perhaps sometimes people abdicate at a lower level out of frustration or um, out of an understanding that um, the the monies are all going up. All of the tax monies are going up, and there's little that can be done. We become dependent. We, for example, as a local community, are seeking to make improvements to the infrastructure of our school district. We want to um, do some major facilities renovations and even propose some new construction. And the way things work in the state of Connecticut is that you have local taxation in the form of property taxes that support your communities. And then there is an income tax and sales tax that supports the state. And it's state funding that comes back to us in the way of grants that allow us to make decisions on how to move forward because we don't have the means in our own local communities to perform these major renovations or constructions. So we have become dependent on them, and so we abdicate in so many ways as a result of the structures that are in place. I'm not sure that's a direct answer to your question, but I would offer to you that I think it's a matter of power and the perception of wanting control, and we need to be vocal in our desire to take that control back to the local level where we can implement it for the welfare of people in our regions.
Yeah, and I again, like, I want to emphasize how much this is a very personal question that each of us have to face because, like, I think for me, like, I look at the generational divide. Like, my parents and grandparents' generations were much more aware of what was going on in local government, the school board, the church parish council, whatever it may have been. Whereas for me, like I kind of was taught, you know, that the ideal of life is to be kind of relaxed, to be this kind of bourgeois ideal, for lack of a better term. So rather than getting involved in what's going on in the neighborhood, I spend my time either doing extracurricular activities or just staying at home watching TV, hanging out with friends. Like there was this kind of apathy that was inculcated in me. And then I started to see that like the more that this mentality becomes normalized, you know, what ends up happening is that you have these bureaucratic structures that gain even more power, and it's not satisfying. So I realized like I can be critical of the political situation, but then at what point do I try to recover my agency? At what point do
Mhm.
I choose to be interested in what's going on in the local level? And starting from basic things like, do I even know who my neighbors are? Like, have I even like spent time with them and got to know what their lives are like? So I don't know, like I think it's a very personal question that we each have to face, and that ultimately when we start to claim that agency, when we start to get involved on the local level, like there is something deeply satisfying about it, you know.
It sounds, Stephen, like you've come to a bit of an epiphany or a revelation, a personal understanding of this.
Yeah,
This lifestyle that you described and that you thought was normal and desirable is, I sense, left you wanting a little bit.
exactly.
And so, going back to your original point about a moral conviction or a judgment about where we have to draw the line about concern for our own personal interests and begin to focus on the fact that our own personal standing is dependent on the circumstances around us, our communities, both local and above, and and that we have a responsibility to contribute to the betterment of those communities if
Mhm.
we are to reap the rewards that will come to them and the freedoms that will result. Um, I think you've come to that discovery. I think it's really just a matter of common sense that ultimately comes to bear when you realize that you're unsatisfied in your circumstances.
Yeah, and it's within our self-interest to be interested in what's going on in the lives of the people around us. Like living this hyper individualized kind of lifestyle. Again, like I was saying, just like staying at home, doing my own thing. It's not satisfying. It's not fulfilling. And again, I lose agency when I live in that kind of way. So this is, I don't know, like the localist emphasis of the ASP's platform is part of what drew me initially. But more broadly speaking, I mean, in cracks in postmodernity, we're always looking for these things that crack through the mainstream discourse and bring about a sense of like again of what it really means to be human and to live fulfilling lives. And this is part of the reason also like I try to invite people on and write about issues that highlight this kind of, as they say, the horseshoe theory. So people on the political or ideological fringes kind of coming together at a certain point. And that's again like the appeal of the ASP, that you see kind of the most important issues from the mainstream left and right platforms being brought together, being synthesized. So there's really, I don't know, like there's this ideal best of both world situations going on. But then, of course, people always argue against third parties, saying, okay, I mean, is this really realistic? Is this a wasted vote? Wouldn't it just make sense to vote for the lesser of two evils? So I don't know, like, what would you say to people who have that kind of argument, saying, is this realistic? Isn't this too idealistic?
Um, I have another thought that I want to get back to, but I don't want to ignore your question. So the answer is, I hear this often, just what you cited, that there's no chance, there's no reality that a third party will emerge and have a positive influence on society. What I offer in counter to that is, if if you believe that the existing paradigm, the duopoly as we refer to it, the
Mhm.
two-party system, Republicans and Democrats, have been able to and will continue to produce all the answers that we need, then by all means continue to embrace that solution. If you find that that system is wanting, if it is not doing all that it can and should be doing for the welfare of people, then why do you refuse to look outside? Because it's got to begin somewhere. And we know that it's going to begin in a small way. We don't expect sweeping changes from either one of the parties that is going to become all of a sudden a panacea for all of America. It's just not in the cards. If we look at it now, Stephen, we see that the two parties, um, instead of bending toward the middle and trying to be attentive to those that are a bit more centrist, they are going more to the polar extremes, and they're pulling that large center portion of the voter base with them in opposite directions. They're further fragmenting and further dividing the nation. We see it clearly. The entrenchment that people have for Donald Trump, believing that this man is the best choice for the future of our nation. The kind of resignation that has gone along with those on the opposite side who really despise Donald Trump, but are willing to embrace a Joe Biden who's aging and obviously showing signs that his abilities to lead are diminished, also fascinates me. But they have no other option. And if they continue to hold to those views that I have to choose between A or B, or I have to choose against A or B, that example you offered of voting for the lesser of two evils, we don't bring about these changes. So I say to people, you're worried about wasting your vote voting for a third party, but in truth, if you're not voting for what you believe in, aren't you wasting your vote in the first place? If you're voting to prevent somebody from getting into office rather than somebody who can bring about the positive changes that you value, it's a hard, the cracks that you say that we should be introducing or trying to implement, if you will, are difficult because we as a culture, we as a society are so ingrained in a way of thinking. But I'm grateful for the perspectives that you bring that challenge those assumptions, challenge those paradigms. Because if we are to bring about true and lasting change, we need to look to new sources in which to make it a reality.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately for me, like I know, third parties have not had the best history in this country, at least, with in terms of gaining, popular support. But that being said, I think their capacity to change the discourse is, like there's so much evidence that indicates that the third parties have influenced the mainstream parties, have changed the conversation in very real, concrete ways. And because I'm so drawn to, the ideals of the ASP, like I think there's so much potential here. There's when people say, just to dismiss these third parties as unrealistic, like no, they're missing a crucial point here. And I think, like there needs to be a real change in the discourse, and the ASP is offering like real substance here.
Right.
This is at least my point of view on this.
It's policy views that are different from the major parties, to be sure. I mean, certainly libertarian views and Green Party views and other third party views that are better known or better established offer that variation in policy as well. But I think we need to overcome the stumbling block we have in that the only way to govern is from the left or from the right. We don't have to operate that way. Other nations don't operate that way. There are coalition governments that are common in other nations, especially in Europe, and it can become a reality here. Stephen, I'd like to suggest that the way that Congress has been behaving in the last couple of months even suggests that we are resorting to these kind of coalition type of government without the formal actions. You've got little factions within the Democratic Party that are willing to go across the aisle and be the problem solvers. You've got a faction within the Republican Party that sought to topple the Speaker of the House, and it was just a small number of them that allied with the Democrats to oust him. And so these coalitions are emerging and are effective, and there are ways in which we can govern. In fact, I think now that the problem with the two-party system is that the party that's in power is seeking only to retain that power so that it can push its agenda. And that agenda isn't always centered on the needs of the people. It's often centered on the party elites, the donor class. If it's not in power, what's it seeking to do? It's seeking to regain power. It's waiting, it's biding its time until the next election when it might be able to persuade enough voters to come onto its side and tip the scales in its favor so that it's got the power now to direct the legislation. And what's happening is that nothing effective is being done because all they're trying to do is consolidate and retain power instead of being forced to form these coalitions and work for the good of the citizenry. As long as we have an either or circumstance, I think that's going to be a continuing problem.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting about the ASP's platform is that, yeah, it's rooted in, certain Christian social teachings, the tradition of Christian democracy, but it has this kind of universal human appeal because, I don't know, like the values that you're promoting have to do with all people for the common good, we can say. But then,
Precisely.
yeah, and then the other thing though that I would wonder, like for a lot of people, for a lot of Christians, I guess we could say, the ASP is, a very attractive alternative. But then, as you mentioned earlier, some Christians are drawn to this kind of integralist platform. So, what would you say to those people who are drawn more to integralism? Like, what's more appealing to you about the Christian democratic tradition?
Well, the Christian democratic tradition really is a view toward natural law. It's a view toward who we are as human beings and how we are to flourish. You mentioned earlier, you saw that your lifestyle or your way of the pursuit of happiness, if you will, was to be maybe disengaged from politics and to be able to enjoy the fruits of your labors with friends and involvements in leisure activities and what have you. But you came to the realization that you need to be more responsible if you are um, to continue to enjoy those privileges, that freedom that you seek, and that's where Christian democracy and these Christian tenets come from. Is that we are created in a way that separates us from anything else. As human beings, we have a dignity and a need for respect, and we need to not only embrace that, but we need to extend that recognition to others. That's why, as I said earlier, our concern for the welfare of all, common good, like you just said, is what drives us. We want peace and solidarity internationally. We want to have a good environment, a healthy environment, clean water, clean air, a stable stable weather patterns, what have you, a mitigation, a reduction in these natural disasters that result from better stewardship of our environment. We want to provide people with health care so that they're able to maintain their physical, mental, emotional well-being. We want to just call people to a greater respect for human dignity. My God, Stephen, we have people these days who are resorting to violent actions toward others in so many ways. It's manifested in mass shootings. It's manifested in assaults. It's manifested in just brutal treatment of other people. We need to raise the bar on people's recognition that we we need to not only claim a human dignity, but we need to offer that same human dignity to others and respect it and preserve it.
Yeah, there's definitely more of this, like you're saying, this trust within this trust in natural law within human nature that human beings naturally have the capacity to recognize the good. And with integralism, I definitely see a lot that's appealing there too. There's a certain level of idealism, this exaltation of the supernatural ideals that again is very appealing, but there is this pessimism, and also there's this backward thinking that kind of it looks to the past to create a solution, which is, I mean, not realistic. Like if we want to look at reality, we have to start with what's happening now. And I also think, at least those coming from a Catholic background, like this is what the Second Vatican Council is saying, that we do need to learn to be in dialogue with what's going on in the current times. This is part of why the church embraced, the right to religious freedom. Um, but yeah, so there's this definite optimism within the ASP's position, and
Right.
that leads me, I wanted to ask for you on a personal level ultimately, why are you doing this? Like, what does this mean to you for your own life, for yourself?
Boy, you have to ask the hard questions, don't you?
Yeah.
Um, Candidly, Stephen, and I've been open about this throughout the process, especially with the party, because I think if I'm not being candid, then it's irresponsible. I don't expect that I'm going to be changing residency to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in January 2025. I don't think the climate is right for the election of a third-party presidential candidate at this time. But I need to grow the influence, and I need to grow the recognition of the ASP party and its platform if it's to be successful at any level. We've been talking a lot about local level politics and the value that it has, being as close to the people who are receiving the service of government. And I think that's where ASP is most effective. So throughout my campaign, while I am campaigning on a national level, and while I'm trying to address issues on that level, I'm also hoping to reach individuals like you, Stephen, or like others who might be in your audience that are compelled or are feeling some of the disillusionment that you cited earlier, and looking for an opportunity to contribute. You don't have to be an elected official. You can just be an active citizen. You can show up at some of these community meetings and share your points of view, share concerns, and share solutions that you see are beneficial for the improvement in our local societies. I'm a banner bearer. I'm a figurehead for the time being for the ASP. I hope someday that the party merits a fair amount of support at a national level, but I hope that only comes after there are well-established ASP elected officials on lower levels, local and county and potentially state levels, that are mindful of this value of subsidiarity, of driving down to the lowest common level the authority to make decisions and to support the people around them. I don't know if that comes as a surprise. I don't know. I hope that doesn't sound defeatist, because it's not intended to. I feel that I need to bring these values to a broader audience, and the ASP nominates a presidential candidate who's going to be its spokesman, who's going to bring these values to the public. And if I am not elected, I don't consider that a defeat. But if I am not successful in at least sharing these ideals and potentially encouraging people to think about them and embrace them, then that is a defeat.
So just to wrap things up, Peter, how can people find out more about the ASP if they're not already following the ASP's platform?
Sure. Thank you, Stephen. So solidarity-party.org is the ASP's website. petersonski.com is my own website. We have a number of social media platforms. I know a lot of people follow social media these days as a way to remain engaged with the things that interest them. So I would offer that Facebook, Twitter, or X, Instagram, other ways that you can follow. The other thing that I could say is the ASP has at least state level, if not lower levels of organization throughout the United States. They're in most cases still in their infancy, still growing, but I would invite those that are truly interested in learning more and actively becoming involved with the party to do just that. We need people to volunteer their time, volunteer their experiences to help the party to grow and to help Americans flourish.
Awesome. Well, Peter, thank you again so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Stephen. And again, thank you for the opportunity and for your interest and support for ASP values.